there's a little known account of the first vision by John Alger, Fanny Alger's brother, where he says that in Kirtland, at the Joseph Smith Sr. home, Joseph Smith, at the beginning of the vision, God touched his eyes.
Really?
And then he was able to see the vision. He remembers Joseph pointing to his eyes as he said this. What was interesting about this account is this is the only account of the first vision we have where Joseph told the first vision just to a private group of saints. It wasn't written for publication and it wasn't told to non-Mormons. And it's the only account that we have of him telling the vision in a family setting. Fanny Alger was living with Joseph Jr.'s family, helping as a servant, like a housemaid. John Alger, her younger brother, was living with Joseph Smith Sr.'s family, helping them out. They're like part of the family, kind of. And Fanny actually becomes part of the family, right? So like, this is a family setting. So he's going to disclose more about the first vision in an intimate, family, faithful LDS setting than he is like to the public. So I was realizing that if you look at that detail, the touching of the eyes, the New Testament, in Matthew and Luke, there are two blind men at Jericho. They call out to Jesus, "Jesus, thou Son of God, have mercy on me." And he says, "What would ye that I should do for you?" And the man says, "Lord, my eyes that I may see." Jesus touches his eyes one by one, and the man is healed from blindness. So what I realized, wait, the first vision, the idea is it's like a healing from spiritual blindness. The touching of the eyes is a spiritual thing that heals the eyes so he can see spiritual things. Then I looked in the book of Abraham 3, it says God put his hand on Abraham's eyes and Abraham could see everything God had made with his hands. Book of Moses, he told Enoch to anoint his own eyes with clay. That's parallel to Jesus in the Gospel of John, heals a blind man's eyes by anointing them with clay. The difference in the book of Moses is the Lord is doing it by proxy. He's having Enoch anoint his own eyes in place of the Lord doing it. Brother of Jared, he doesn't touch his eyes, he touches the stone. He asked the brother of Jared, "What is it you would that I should do for you?" It's the same exact question asked by the blind man in the Gospels. The brother of Jared wants him to touch the stones. Why? So the stones will glow in their barges so they can see. Then he gives him the interpreters, which are two stones that he wears in front of his eyes so he can see spiritual things. It's like a pattern over and over in Latter-day Saint scripture. And there are some parallel things in a couple of places in the Bible, like Isaiah's mouth being touched and purified so he can speak for God. I was thinking, this is how I become a seer, is this first vision. I was writing my paper on this. I was actually sitting in the library cafe at Utah State, and suddenly all kinds of things came together. A lot of history is connecting dots. We have the historical sources. We have the data points in those sources, but they don't become a narrative until we connect the dots to see the cause and effect relationships between them. Joseph Smith says in Nauvoo that in ancient times, mountaintops served as temples where people could receive ordinances. Brother of Jared, ancient world, mountaintop. This is a temple setting. He's conversing with the Lord, it says in Ether 3, through the veil. And the Lord puts his hand through the veil to touch the stones. And the brother of Jared sees the Lord's hand, and the Lord asks him a series of questions to test his faith and knowledge, beginning with a question about his hand. Once the brother of Jared has passed the test, the Lord admits him into his presence and tells him, "You've been redeemed from the fall," which evokes the whole backstory of the creation and Adam and Eve. And then he gives him these white stones, which is Revelation 2:17, which Joseph quotes, "To him that overcometh, I will give unto him a white stone, in the which is written a new name, which no man knoweth save him that receiveth it." And think of the brother of Jared. Why do we call him that? That is the idea of like a secret, sacred, esoteric name. It's like the white stone, a new name that no one knows. Then the brother of Jared is given a revelation that is so high, so great, he can't share it with others, so he just puts it in the sealed portion. This is the temple. This is the apex of the endowment. These are the things that happen in detail. 13 years before Joseph institutes the endowment in Nauvoo, I had studied the Nauvoo endowment. I had studied parallels of it with Freemasonry. And as far as I was concerned, Joseph Smith didn't know a thing about the Nauvoo endowment until he became a Freemason early in 1842. And suddenly I was seeing the structure of the endowment is in the Book of Ether that he dictates in 1829. Okay, what are the historical sources that talk about what was in it? It turns out, I've written a whole book on this, right? The last 116 pages reconstructing the Book of Mormon's missing stories. One of the major sources that I use there is an interview that someone did with Joseph Smith Sr., where they described how the interpreters got to the Nephites. So we know from the Book of Ether how the interpreters got to the Jaredites. The Lord gives them to the brother of Jared on this mountaintop. We later know in the Book of Mormon, or maybe earlier in the Book of Mormon, the Nephites had the interpreters. It never tells us how they got them. That seems like a big oversight. Like, the interpreters were important. If you look at who in the Book of Mormon first had those interpreters, it appears to be King Mosiah the First. Well, his story was in the Lost Pages. We only get the thumbnail sketch version in the Book of Omni. It's like 13 verses long. But his story was a long, complex story in the Lost Pages. If he's the one who got the interpreters, the details of that story would have been in the Lost Pages. In this interview that someone did with Joseph Sr. in 1830, he tells them about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and he tells them a story that is not in our Book of Mormon text, but it's about how the Nephites got the interpreters.
What? Are you serious?
Yep. Scholars have pointed out that this is a gap in the Book of Mormon text that we have. Why doesn't it explain where they got the interpreters? And they've even posited that could have been in the Lost Pages. And so in that narrative, Guy Fayette Lapham, who interviewed Joseph Sr., he says they were traveling after they got to their promised land, sometime later, they have another sort of exodus. They're in between temples, apparently, because they have a tabernacle. That's a portable temple. And they're being led by the Liahona, this guy. And the Liahona leads him to an object. And he doesn't know what that object is. He takes the object, he carries it into the tabernacle. And the voice of the Lord in the tabernacle, I'm assuming from behind the veil of the Holy of Holies where the Lord's presence dwells, says, take that object and put it on your face and cover your face in an animal skin. And he does. And he can see anything. It's the interpreters, right? And so at that point, he says, the Liahona stopped working because it had been replaced now with the interpreters. That would account for how the Nephites got the interpreters. They're led to them by the Liahona, is what this narrative is saying. And it would also explain another question scholars have raised. Why did the Nephites stop using the Liahona? Because later on, we know in the Book of Alma, they have the Liahona. It's being handed on. They're not using it. They're fighting with the Lamanites. They're traveling in the wilderness. They could sure use the Liahona to guide them. They never use it. It's been replaced. It stopped working. What I was seeing in that narrative is that story that Joseph Smith Sr. tells, that's like another bookend to the story of, in Ether 3, about the Jaredites getting the interpreters. This is a temple narrative. He goes in the tabernacle. I don't know if I said this. The Lord asks him, what is that in your hand? The man says he did not know, but had come to inquire. Now,
you can't make this stuff up.
You can't make this stuff up. That struck me. I've heard this kind of question, this kind of dialogue somewhere before, and I realized that the story of the brother of Jared and this story, they fit together. This is now 1828. In the Lost Pages, Joseph is dictating the story that prefigures what he's going to introduce 14 years later in the Nauvoo Endowment. And then I started to see, okay, and I won't go too much in this because it's just like
I'm already starting to put, like, First Nephi to me is even, you're not even talking about it anyway. Every vision.
So Joseph Smith's first vision and the subsequent finding of his white seer stone, we have an account of that, a detailed account. It turns out they have massive temple endowment parallels. Massive. Suddenly this is exploding in my head. So at the beginning of the 1820s, Joseph is already talking about a vision that has elements of the Nauvoo endowment. Now, this was head-spinning for me because, like I said, I thought he doesn't know anything about the endowment until 42. And suddenly I'm finding, no, there are clear signs of it in 29, in 28, and back around 1820 with the first vision. Literally day one of the restoration.
From the beginning.
He's a teenage kid, and he's already got, like, much of the structure of the endowment. And I thought, this is...
Oh, my gosh. My mind is just so blown right now.
So, okay, here's another thing. Okay, in this interview, Fayette Lapham says, and Fayette Lapham was never LDS. He never joined the church. He appears to have never read the Book of Mormon. He gives details in his account that we get confirmed from other members of the Smith family and other insiders only after Lapham publishes his account, which means he had real inside information. He really did interview Joseph Sr. and learn details. He says that Joseph Sr. told him that on the top plate of the golden plates, the interpreter sat on that top plate, but on that plate also were engravings of what he described as the implements of Masonry, Freemasonry. The two main symbols of Freemasonry are the compass and the square. In every Masonic lodge, on the altar of that lodge, there's a Bible, and on that Bible sits a compass and a square. So the compass and square are
So
already on the gold plates. 15 years before Joseph becomes a Mason, or more. 15 years before he becomes a Mason is when he gets the plates, but he'd seen them 4 years earlier. So almost
what?
20 years before he becomes a Freemason, he's talking about the compass and the square are on the plates. So there's major temple endowment stuff. So my book on the lost pages, I actually have a lot more about how even what we're told about the translation process of the Book of Mormon in chapter 3 of that
It's
book
very
talks about temple parallels. Like
what?
they're all over. They're all over.
So
And
you're
so this blew my mind. One of the things I thought to myself was, okay, however brilliant Joseph Smith was, I just don't see a 14, 15-year-old thinking, I'm going to come up with a really complex ritual, temple ritual. And someday, not now, not anytime soon, but like 20 years from now, when I'm like pushing 40 or something, I'm going to create
implement.
a ceremony where I'll
Wow.
implement this. I don't believe that. Even if Joseph Smith had that intention early on, he would have done it in the early days of the church. He wouldn't have waited till 1842. I just didn't believe that a young man had this sort of foresight about what he was going to do with his life. And what I was finding was really powerful. I was seeing things about the first vision. It's a much more complex thing than we realized. The first vision is a healing from spiritual blindness as his eyes are touched. It's an initiation into being a seer. His eyes are touched so that he might see. All different things melded together. So I was seeing the power of it. And this started immediately making me wonder, should I be going back to the church?